Anyway, this evening I'm introducing myself. I've basically got a background in defence intelligence. That's where I spent most of my working life, and I've been at the ANU since 2002, and I guess I probably have continued to do pretty much what I was doing in defence when I worked in DIO and so on, where I've remained an analyst. And anyway, what I'm going to try and do this evening is explain to you the situation in Syria, as far as I understand it, and I hope that'll clarify things for you. If not, you'll be perhaps as confused as I am about the situation there. But anyway, of course, everybody wants to know what's behind the violence, and whoops, sorry, I just turned it off. And I've put up some comparisons for you. Syria is less than a quarter the size of New South Wales. If you look at the geography of it, it's bordered on the north side by Turkey, on the east by Iraq, south Jordan, southwest is Israel, and on the southwest also you've got Lebanon. And the geography is important. It's got that stretch of coast though on the west side, as you can see there, where you've got Tartus, which is an important port from our point of view. If you look at the actual physical features of Syria, there's a mountain range along the coast, and so you've got a rain shadow area inland, and so most of Syria is semi-arid once you go further east and as you go closer and further into Iraq. If you just have a look at the road system there from Iraq, you can see that there's three main highways going in, 11 there, 12 and 1. And as I'll explain later on, these are quite important from the point of view of getting from Iraq into Syria. Anyway, some other comparisons with Australia. Australia is 41 times larger than Syria. Population pretty much the same, in fact. Their GDP is 8.5 times smaller than ours. And if you look at the Defence Force, their defence budget is about 1/13 of ours. But for that, they're getting a force which is 5 times larger than us in the active force, and substantially larger reserves. You might wonder how they can do that on less money. The reality is that they buy Eastern European equipment, which is much cheaper than US equipment, and they pay much less money to their soldiers, so considerable savings in that area. Anyway, turning to the 2011-2012 uprising, the causes of the unrest were 42 years of al-Assad family authoritarian rule, brutality of the regime, government corruption. There's a youth bulge and high unemployment. There's the knock-on effects of the Arab Spring. And then there's the Muslim majority desire for proportional political representation. If you look at the incidents where they're occurring, essentially these are the main points of problem as far as Syria goes. Deir ez-Zor in the east, which is a Christian enclave, and then there's a fault line which runs down the west side, which is essentially where Sunni Muslims come up against Christians and Alawites, who are Shia Muslims. So a lot of the places you've heard about regularly, Aleppo, Hama, Homs, Damascus obviously, Dara, are all along that fault line, which I'll talk about a bit more. Aleppo is the biggest city with about 2.9 million people. Damascus is next with about 2.5 million people. So I suppose Aleppo in population size about the same as Sydney. If you look at the incidents of death, again you can see that it's along that fault line essentially, and along the highway in the east side of the country. That's covering the period from 18th of March last year through to 18th of March this year. And if you look through sort of timeline here, you can see that there are spikes every so often where there's been something like the Ula massacre, for example. Looking at the refugee situation, most of the refugees obviously have fled to neighbouring countries, but not so much to Iraq. I guess it's not a hospitable place to flee to, but certainly to Turkey and into Lebanon. And you can see there the red triangles are occupied camps, and the green is concentrations of Syrians who are staying with local families. And then there's, down the bottom here, you've got camps under construction in Jordan. But if you look at the numbers, they do vary very widely because of different sources of information. So you come up with a big range, for example, 868 to 3,046 opposition fighters killed, 979 to 1,423 protesters killed, and so on. There's general agreement that more than 3,000 members of the security forces have been killed. So roughly about a quarter of the casualties up till now have been members of the security forces. This is the kind of website that exists that you've got to go trawling around to get information. It's probably accurate about some aspects, but again, it's very much reliant on who provides the information and how it's provided and so on. And obviously a lot of these websites have got their own agenda to promote. I think as I go through it, you'll realise that the security situation there is quite complicated, and that's because of the number of actors involved, and that presents challenges for everybody that pretty much that looks at Syria, whether they're intelligence analysts, whether they're academics, or journalists like Robert Fisk. I've followed Robert Fisk's writing for many years. He lives in Lebanon, and you'd expect that he probably has a very good handle on the situation in Syria. But it's funny actually, when you travel to places often, I've found that you can actually get more information from outside the country sometimes than you can get from within the country. And I don't know, I guess he's probably best placed to comment on the situation in Lebanon in Syria from where he is in Lebanon. Some of the historical background to Syria. It was administered by France until 1946, and so France still has a strong interest in Syria, and that's come up in its initiation of the Friends of Syria group, which I'll mention a bit later. But in 1949, the fledgling democracy, I guess you could call it, was overturned by a CIA-sponsored right-wing coup, and the reason for that was that the government was being obdurate about allowing a pipeline to cross Syrian territory, and it was considered the easiest way to get the agreement was to get rid of the government and put a new government in that was going to agree to the pipeline. A lot of people think that the overthrow of the Iranian government in 1953 was the first attempt by the US to change governments in the Middle East, but in fact this was the first one that I'm aware of. This is where the pipeline was going through, and it needed to go through southern Syria. The pipeline no longer operates because there are now more economical ways of getting the oil out. Anyway, following a further coup in 1963, the Alawite-dominated Ba'ath Party came to power, and since then the Ba'ath Party has been the dominant authority in Syria. Turning now to the al-Assad family, the country remained politically unstable until 1970, and then General Hafez al-Assad, who had a working background, he wasn't a sophisticated guy, but obviously an astute judge of people, seized power and declared himself president. And then he did the usual things that people do in that position. He got rid of potential adversaries and so on, and consolidated his position. Just a word on the Alawites. There are various names for them, but they actually are a branch of Shia Islam. So they are natural allies for Iran, and they've acted as a conduit for Iran to provide material and so on through to Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is another Shia group. Anyway, Hafez al-Assad soon banned all opposition, and then in 81-82 there was a major insurgency going on through the country, and he put the military on to dealing with the main area of opposition, which was located in Hama, and they killed probably about 20,000 people. and put down the uprising. Of course, in those days there weren't the mobile phones and the Facebook and all that kind of stuff for passing information, and so it was probably some while before the outside world was aware of the scale of the killing, but it certainly consolidated his rule. Over the years there have been smaller uprisings, usually involving the Muslim Brotherhood and other anti-regime elements, and they've been a fairly regular occurrence over the years. Anyway, this is what Hama looked like in 1982 after they'd finished with it. Probably remind you a bit about how Beirut looked after the civil war in Lebanon. This is the al-Assad family, and Hafez al-Assad married Anisa Makhlouf. She comes from a family that was very, very wealthy, billionaire family. And if you look at the back row of the children there, you've got Maher, Bashar, Basil, Majid, and Bushra. And of those, Bushra married Asaf Shawkat, who I'll mention again in a moment. But Basil, who was being groomed to be Hafez's successor, was killed in a car crash. He liked fast cars, and he killed himself in a car crash. So in 1994, Hafez al-Assad decided that at that point he needed to groom Bashar al-Assad to take over. Majid was a sickly guy, so he wasn't going to be a very suitable substitute. And Maher was a bit mentally unstable, so his father decided it was best to put him in the military where he couldn't do too much harm. Anyway, Bashar married Asma al-Assad, very attractive girl, who was born in England but is of Syrian background. But Hafez died in 2000, and he was succeeded by his son Bashar al-Assad, and he was appointed, they had to change the constitution a bit, to allow for him to take over at the age of 34. However, as you know, in many regimes that's not a problem. You know, Russians do it continually, and so it was just suitably changed. And Bashar had actually trained to be a doctor, had worked in a hospital, went to UK for training to become an ophthalmologist, until he was brought back in 94 for Hafez to groom him to be the successor. And so he was put into the military and did various things to make himself more acceptable to the population as the successor. Going when Bashar took over, there was a period called the Damascus Spring, which was a period where people thought there were going to be significant change in Syria. But that ended in 2001, and the people who had called for democratic elections and so on, and campaign of civil disobedience, found themselves fairly smartly put into jail, and since then there haven't really been any significant reforms. Anyway, looking at the power brokers, I think it's true to say that Bashar's personality is much quieter sort of guy. I mean, he's quite cunning, but he doesn't have that sort of ruthlessness that Hafez displayed. But he is surrounded by a group of people who really rely on the regime for their existence and for their wealth and so on. And of course they want him to remain in power, and there's nobody else who's been groomed to be a potential successor to him. Anyway, some of the key regime figures are Maher, the younger brother, who is the commander of the 4th Division. As I said, he's a bit unstable. In fact, he shot his brother-in-law in the stomach, Asaf Shawkat, and had to be rushed off to hospital. Has survived it, obviously, but he can be quite violent. He reminds me a bit of Saddam Hussein's sons in that respect. These are some of the other regime figures: Walid Muallim, Adel Safar, General Ibrahim al-Shah, General el-Frey. A lot of the people who are in power in Syria are ex-military senior officers. Rami Makhlouf is related to the Makhlouf that I mentioned before, Hafez's wife, and very wealthy, and so a lot of the money side of things with the regime seems to link back to Rami. Another important figure is General Rajiha, who's the Minister of Defence. And if you turn now to the opposition groups, at the moment you've got the Syrian National Council, which is essentially backed by the US and the West. There's the National Coordination Committee for Democratic Change, which is really backed by the Arab League. Then you've got various different people pushing their own agendas, and then you've got other opposition groups. The Friends of Syria, as I mentioned before, is a French initiative, and it's to bring together a group of countries and bodies to try and find a solution for the Syrian problem outside of the UN process, because clearly it's not going to be very easy to get anything done through the UN because of China and Russia blocking any action against Syria. In fact, even the last day or so with the Hula massacre, which is fairly clearly the regime responsible for it, the Russians are saying, well, they want to sort of wait and see what the findings of the commission are that's been set up to inquire into it, and so on. You know, they're sort of not taking it on that that it was the regime that was responsible, although clearly it was. Anyway, Australia is part of this group, where we continue to protest above our weight, I guess you could say. A lot of the times I've noticed that, you know, the things that are done by government, like I believe the ambassador, Syrian ambassador was called in today, that's largely done, I think, for domestic consumption, because it won't get news anywhere else. And of course we tend to see things from our own perspective. And I worked in Washington for 3 years, and I think when John Howard visited, they didn't even rate a mention in the Washington Post, although of course it was all over the papers here. So it's an interesting difference of perspective depending on where you are. Anyway, Burhan Ghaliun, he's Syrian National Council chairman. He's resigned under pressure because he's closely associated with the Muslim Brotherhood, and the West and the US feel that he's a problem in terms of fundraising, because, you know, many of the Arab countries don't want to contribute if it's going to be putting money into the Muslim Brotherhood area, because they see the Muslim Brotherhood as a potential problem. Riyad al-Assad, who's the Free Syrian Army commander, is another leading figure, and his deputy, Malik Kurdi. And these are a few others. Mustafa Ahmed al-Sheikh, Ali Bayouni, and al-Maleh, who's the human rights spokesman, who's seen by the regime at least as an opposition figure, although I should think he probably sees himself as being an objective observer. And then there's Samar Nasher, who's a member of the Secretariat of the Damascus Declaration. Anyway, looking a bit more closely at the current uprising, it dates back to a public demonstration linked to the Arab Spring, which was on the 26th of January, when Hassan al-Ali Akleh, who I'm sure you probably haven't heard of, from the town of Al-Hasaka, doused himself with petrol and set himself on fire. There's no picture of that. However, I do have a picture of the incident that led to the start of the Arab Spring, which was the one that occurred in Tunis in December of 2010. Anyway, mass protests began in Dara on the 15th of March, and the security situation has deteriorated pretty much since then. And as the situation got increasingly out of hand, the regime then deployed its security assets to deal with it. And essentially they were given carte blanche to get on with it and to crush the uprising. And I repeated the map because just to show you well where Al-Hasaka is, where he doused himself with petrol, and where the reactions were in Dara. So quite well spaced within the country. You'd expected that perhaps that it would be sort of in the same general area, but I think that the anger within the Sunni Muslim population is widespread, and so it was picked up in Dara as well. Anyway, a lot of this comes back, as it does in most things, I suppose, in the Middle East, to religion, and I'll just explain why that's the case. Syria's population, as I said before, is 22.5 million, and 74% of the population is Sunni Muslim, which includes Turks and Kurds. Then it's about 12% Alawite, who, as I mentioned, are Shia Muslims, and then 10% Christian, and then 4% other groups, mainly Shia and Druze. But the interesting thing is that there's 18 million Syrians who live outside of Syria, the diaspora, and they are almost entirely Christian. So, in fact, they relate, I suppose, to a relatively small percentage of the population back in Syria. And if you look at the, you might remember where the incidents flowed along that sort of line, it's pretty much where Sunni Islam bumps up against Christianity and Shia Islam. And I mentioned about the Christian enclave on the east side, where there's also been problems. Anyway, the international media has portrayed the events in Syria as civilians or freedom fighters being massacred by regime forces. And of course, that's been pretty well supported by a lot of the mobile phone footage. And however, even so, the Assad regime still attracts considerable support from the diaspora for the reason that I mentioned. They're also part of the minority element. And of course, the issue for them, as it is for the minority element within Syria, is that if the Sunni Muslims took control, they fear that it would be a bloodbath against the minorities. And in the best case, what it would mean was that they would lose their position of influence. Similar in some ways, I suppose, to what happened in Iraq, you know, because Saddam's Iraq was run by 20% of the population who were Sunni Muslim, and 60% were Shia Muslim and 20% were Kurds. So you had a small group that were actually dominating the country. So it's pretty much the same sort of situation in Syria. Anyway, from as early as March last year, large crowds have actually rallied in support of Assad, although they get nowhere near as much publicity as the ones who are protesting against Assad. But in particular, in the cities of Damascus, Aleppo, Tartus and Latakia, there have been pro-Assad rallies. And that's where those places are. And support rallies have also occurred in Australia because, again, as I mentioned, the diaspora is predominantly from minority groups. I think there's widespread recognition that the al-Assad regime is autocratic and ruthless, but it still is a secular state in the same way that Saddam's was. And as I say, minority groups are fearful that if there is a change of regime, if the Alawites lose control, then that would be bad for everybody else that was in the minority area. Maybe good for the Sunni Muslims, but that's not good for the minority, I guess. Particularly if there was zero tolerance for other religions. This was a protest in Sydney. We love Bashar al-Assad. I haven't seen much protest activity in Australia or support activity in Australia more recently. I think they're probably just keeping a low profile at the moment, the people that support al-Assad. Anyway, turning to the Syrian armed forces, because of course they are critical to the survival of a regime, and along with the intelligence services, which I'll talk about in a minute. Anyway, the Syrian armed forces number 295,000 active personnel and 314,000 reservists. But of them, 200,000 or so of the career soldiers in the military are Alawites. Of the 200,000 career soldiers, 140,000 of those are Alawites, while about 80% of the officers are Alawites. So they have a pretty strong grip on the military power in Syria. If you look at the weapons systems that they've got, the main suppliers have been Eastern Bloc, and so they've got things like MiG-29s, which are very capable aircraft. They've got lots of Eastern Bloc tanks like the T-72s, probably something like 1,500 of those. So in terms of numbers of personnel and equipment, they're pretty well off, in fact. And if you look at the elite divisions of the Republican Guard and so on, commanded by Bashar's brother, they are exclusively Alawite. So the difference, it's different though in the reserve area, because in the reserve, most of them are Sunni Muslims. So there are problems if you were to call up the reservists. There's compulsory national service in Syria. So everybody of middle 20s has had military training. And the danger, I guess, is that if you were to use Sunnis against Sunnis, then you'd end up with a problem, because they would start to defect, which is what's been happening with the Free Syrian Army, which I'll come on to. Anyway, another powerful regime asset is the intelligence and security agencies, and there's a number of those. And of course, they're responsible for regime security and identifying and eliminating counter-regime elements. You can always pick them because they wear dark glasses, leather jackets, and designer trousers usually. So they're sort of they're secret police, but they're sort of not so secret. But they're intimidating because they're a rule unto themselves. Lots of different intelligence agencies and not many pictures of the heads of agencies, as you might expect. Anyway, the armed forces were very successful in suppressing all of the uprisings that took place in the past, in the 70s and the 80s, and particularly Hama. And they've been deployed since the early stages of the current uprising, since March last year, along with the security police. It's been said that if the soldiers refuse to fire on demonstrators, they themselves get shot. That's what has been said. I don't know if that's true or not. But the really frightening people, I think, are the Shabiha, and particularly this guy. Anyway, they are the ones who have been responsible for the massacres. But they are in civilian clothing. They're armed guys. They're thugs. Some of them have links to the security forces. Some of them are criminals, and much of the random killing has been done by these people, who often, I suspect, loot once they've killed the people. So they're in it for a variety of reasons other than protection of the regime, but they are useful to the regime because they are deniable. Now we look at the armed opposition. There's various different elements. You've got the Syrian Liberation Army, and it's not clear how many people are involved with that. Then there's the Free Syrian Army, which is mainly defectors, which could be as many as 40,000, but maybe as little as 15,000. You've got the Jabhat al-Nusra, which is also known as the al-Nusra Front, which is a jihadist group based in Homs. And then there's some other armed groups that are less important. When the government talks about gangs of armed terrorists, what they're talking about is the armed civilian opposition people, mainly the Syrian Liberation Army. And generally speaking, they fight in built-up areas because it's easier for them to do that, and it's harder for the government to retaliate. Anyway, the al-Nusra Front was formed in 2011, and in January this year they called for armed struggle against the Syrian government, and they've claimed responsibility for a number of bombings. I think that the people who are infiltrating from Iraq are most likely going to the al-Nusra Front. That's the most likely place that they would go. There have been reports that a number of Syrians who were fighting in Iraq, for example, have come back from Iraq and are now back in the al-Nusra Front, which would give them the expertise to do the kind of bombings that they're claiming, which are very much like the ones that occur in Iraq, the multiple vehicle bombings, targeting government facilities and so on. Anyway, the armed opposition are pretty much lightly armed, and they've mainly got weapons that have been smuggled into Syria from Lebanon and Turkey, and from various border crossings in Jordan, Lebanon and Turkey. That's not a new thing. Smuggling over those routes has occurred for a very long time, including weapons. So it's not an uncommon thing to be doing. Now it's happening in bigger numbers, and this is northern Lebanon. And here you can see container loads of weapons coming in from places like Libya. Anyway, the armed opposition operating in urban areas have been quite effective in the sense that, as I said, they've killed more than 3,000 security force personnel. And as you can understand, the Syrian military is very angry about this and not prepared to really show much quarter when they come up against the armed opposition. The Free Syrian Army, they're essentially coming out of the reserve forces, and mostly they're sort of lower ranking people, but they say that they're coming out to protect the local population because they're concerned about the activities of the Shabiha in particular. This is the FSA leader, who's a colonel, Riyad al-Assad and others. Not very good picture because it was on mobile phone. Has its main base in Turkey, just across the border from Aleppo. Mostly the people who are deserting are not in a position to bring any major hardware with them, so they only usually bring light weapons and munitions, and so as a result they're not in a position to be able to take on the Syrian military, so they're basically involved in guerrilla warfare against the Syrian military. But their main target has been the Shabiha militia because of the massacres perpetrated by the Shabiha. So the nature of the fighting at the moment, what usually seems to happen at a local level is you've got the armed opposition will either ambush or bomb, they use IEDs quite a lot, the Syrian police or the military. They'll kill several of them, then they'll withdraw to a built-up area. What then happens is the army will deploy, and they don't want to get engaged in street fighting, so they'll bring in the artillery. They'll fire artillery into the area until they've subdued the people that are fighting in that area, and then at that point usually the opposition people have escaped, and leaving the civilian population that's left there to the mercy of the Shabiha, were then sent in and essentially kill people. And as you saw with Hula, they're not discriminating, they'll kill children and whoever they can get their hands on. They're just terrible people. But anyway, that's what seems to happen generally. I suppose you could fault the armed opposition in the sense that they're using the population as a shield. They say that we're here to defend the population, but what they're actually doing is using the population as a shield and creating indirectly civilian casualties. Anyway, in 2012, the major offensives focused on Baba Ammar, which is a suburb of Homs, and Idlib, and they've both been taken by the government forces. The opposition can't really sort of sustain for very long against the government forces because there's such a mismatch of power capability. And so essentially what they'll do is get the military involved and then they'll leave. But their best prospect really is to try and wear them down through guerrilla warfare. Anyway, after we've gone through that process that I mentioned, the Shabiha have been in, they'll usually then have a clean-up of the area, and then they'll allow the Red Crescent in and the media or UN observers or whatever. This is Idlib and Homs, where those two major offensives took place. This is Baba Ammar, which is a suburb of Homs. And you can see from the this chart here at the bottom, which shows damage to buildings and craters, how intensive the shelling of that area was before the military was able to regain control of it. And this is Idlib, which is not a very large place, but nonetheless quite difficult to capture if you're having to fight from house to house. Anyway, looking at the Hula massacre, which occurred on Friday, the UN mission says that 108 bodies were there. They've been revising the numbers a bit, but anyway, the last figure I saw was 108. Of those, 32 were children, and age less than 10. And it actually took place in Taldo, which is part of Hula area. But the killing was apparently done by the shelling and the Shabiha. We had the usual sort of things with Ban Ki-moon and the UN envoy Kofi Annan saying that this was appalling and brutal and indiscriminate and disproportionate and flagrant violation of international law and all that kind of stuff, which is all very predictable. But really they're impotent to do very much about it. That shows you where Hula is, and there's some of the bodies lined up. Anyway, look at the international actors and their interests. A variety of people who have got their foot in the door, including the Arab League and the United Nations. One of the interesting ones, though, is Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which is better known, correct name is the title there, but better known to most people as Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And that has had a support infrastructure in Syria since at least 2003, because it was basically a rat line for people coming into Iraq to join Al-Qaeda in Iraq during the period after the American invasion. So they've had a support network in Syria since at least 2003. So of course, it's not very difficult then to reverse the process and use that same network to infiltrate people back into Syria, which is what's been happening more recently. It's quite hard to get a feel for the numbers involved. Al-Qaeda in Iraq says that they haven't been able to do anything substantive for a while because there's too many people gone off to Syria to fight. And so I don't know what that means, whether it's 100 people or 200 people or what. It's not very clear. People in Syria are a bit closed-mouthed about how many foreigners are there because they don't want to scare people away from providing funding to the opposition. So you've got the ironic situation at the moment where the West and Al-Qaeda are on the same side. Anyway, Dr. Zawahiri, who's the new leader of Al-Qaeda since bin Laden was killed, has been encouraging people in AQI to go to Syria and to take on the regime there in support of the Sunni Muslims. And there's 3 routes in. As I mentioned, the main one, though, is that central one. And the kind of bombings that we've been seeing this year in Syria, very reminiscent of the kind of bombings that have occurred in Iraq in the past, multiple vehicle bombs using suicide bombers. Suicide bombing isn't something that's been very common. I don't think it occurred much at all before last year in Syria, whereas now it's becoming the norm. This is a bombing in Damascus, and then the one just a couple of weeks ago which killed 55 people, which was a major bombing. The bombings have been targeting the security forces, so of course it doesn't make much sense. The armed opposition say the regime is doing this themselves to blame the armed opposition. Well, they would never do it against security targets. They might possibly do it against a civilian target, but certainly they're not going to bomb their own intelligence and security areas. So it's clearly not the government doing these bombings. It's more likely to be the al-Nusra Front and people who've come in from Al-Qaeda. Anyway, looking at Iran's interests, Iran being Shia supports regional Shia groups, as you might expect, including in Iraq and in Lebanon. And for many years it supported the al-Assad regime and the Lebanese Hezbollah through Syria. And it's clearly not in Iran's interest for a Sunni-dominated regime to emerge in Syria. It's reportedly assisting the Syrian government in a range of ways with riot control equipment, intelligence monitoring techniques, oil supply, and Quds Force volunteers. Turning to the Arab League, it's Sunni-dominated, and it would like to see a Sunni regime in Damascus, but it's also wary about some of the knock-on effects of the Arab Spring on places like Bahrain, where you've got a small number of Sunnis dominating a larger number of Shias. So you've got that kind of minority control situation there. And I guess Saudi Arabia itself is potentially vulnerable in the future as well because of the unpopularity of the royal family. Anyway, Qatar and Saudi Arabia are manoeuvring to try and bring in a Wahhabi regime in Syria and are providing money and weapons to the opposition groups. Looking at Russia, President Medvedev was the first Russian head of state to visit Syria, and he did that in May 2010, and where his aim was to consolidate relations between the two countries. And Russia is now Syria's largest supplier of arms, contributing 65% of Syria's weapons. It's been a fairly constant friend to Syria, and the reason is its self-interest, because it's got a port facility at Tartus, and this gives it a foothold in the Mediterranean. So it's important to Russian interests to be able to maintain that port access. There's a larger picture of Tartus. They've also got a SIGINT station at a place called Jabal al-Hara, which is south of Damascus, and they use that to monitor US, Israeli and NATO communications and air traffic. So they would be able to give Iran early warning if Israel was to mount an airstrike or attempt to do an airstrike out of Israel to Iran, which would be useful obviously if you had early warning of incoming aircraft. It also monitors opposition communications, so it plays an important role for the regime as well. Looking at China, their interest is the trade aspect really, more than anything else, which is worth 2.2 billion a year to them, and it's almost entirely one-way traffic. They are, however, interested in the gas and oil side of things in Syria, and they've become more actively involved in that area. The UN, Russia and China have blocked international involvement in Syria to protect their interests. And the reason they're doing that is because if you think back to Libya, they gave in to the request to agree to humanitarian intervention in Libya, and they then found themselves marginalised. And so after the conflict ended in Libya, all of the oil contracts and the arms contracts have been going to Western countries and not to Russia or China. Clearly they're not going to make that same mistake again in Syria. Western Europe is reluctant to become directly involved, and so they'll continue to talk about sanctions and work through the Arab League and blame Russia and China for the ongoing problems there because the UN isn't able to operate effectively. Australia is part of that group, and again we sort of seem to be punching above our weight a bit. Anyway, Israel and by extension the USC regime change as a way of containing Iran and Hezbollah because it would stop that conduit through to Lebanon. And Stratfor, which is usually pretty well connected in these matters, say that the US has been covertly arming and funding Syrian opposition groups as well as Libya has been doing the same thing. Essentially what the US wants to do is to contain the situation to Syria and weaken Iran's influence. The danger, of course, though, is that if arms become widely available within Syria, what you might then end up with is a civil war. And of course, a civil war is going to result in lots more casualties. So it's, there's some problems in doing that, I believe. Anyway, what to do about all of this? These are response options 101, I suppose, for diplomats. You hold lots of meetings and maybe have commissions of inquiry from time to time and noisily condemn things. You can impose sanctions and restrict regime travel. We've done that as well. Freeze Syrian assets abroad. Refer alleged war crimes to the International Criminal Court. Send observers to report, which of course is happening at the moment. Provide arms and money to the opposition, which we're doing, or is being done. Pressure Russia and China to try and influence Syria to change its ways. That's the latest, that's what's happening at the moment with attempts to get Russia to put a bit more pressure on Assad. The problem for everybody, though, is that there is no clear or obvious successor to Assad. And if there was somebody in the regime that could take his place, that might be a way out of all of this, but realistically there isn't. And you get rid of Assad, you're going to create a situation of chaos as we've got in Libya at the moment. And of course there's the intervene militarily option. And anyway, the reasons why that's not likely to happen is that we know what happened in Iraq and Libya, which was pretty disastrous for human rights and for civilian casualties. And so that's not likely to be repeated, particularly the land invasion aspect of it. Lack of domestic support for costly military invasions. I don't think there's much support in any Western country now, given the experience of Iraq and Afghanistan for these kinds of occupations. The Syrian Air Defence Force, which is something like 40,000 personnel, has advanced surface-to-air missiles, so it means that the Libya option of just using aircraft to go and bomb strategic targets isn't really isn't really a viable one, because we would, or NATO would, lose lots of airplanes, inevitably. Clearly that's not something that they're prepared to consider. And of course the danger is that you end up with a confrontation with Russia or Iran as well, which could end up being a ripple effect. Anyway, this is the kind of equipment that the Syrian Air Defence Force has. They've got 25 air defence brigades, each with 6 SAM batteries, and they've got 130 air defence batteries. Now, you know, you could take out maybe quite a few of those if you had a big build-up and a concerted campaign, but it would still leave a lot of equipment there to bring down airplanes. Anyway, Kofi Annan's much vaunted 6-point peace plan is this, that all parties commit to work with the envoy, appoint an empowered interlocutor, all parties agree to stop the fighting, and they've all blamed each other for not doing that. That was supposed to come into effect, the ceasefire, that is, from the 12th of April, and to be observed by the UN observers. Timely provision of humanitarian assistance to all areas affected by the fighting. Release arbitrarily detained persons. Some people have been released, but there's still, I think, something like 25,000 being detained at the moment. Ensure freedom of movement throughout the country for journalists, and respect freedom of association and the right to demonstrate. So that's what the UN is putting pressure on Russia now to get Assad's regime to comply with this, because they say that Assad's regime is not complying. Assad will say that they're only responding to provocations from the Syrian Liberation Army and the armed opposition groups, or the armed terrorists as they refer to them. Anyway, what we've got at the moment is we've got UN ceasefire monitors, headed by Major General Mood from Norway. There's 270 there at the moment, 300 are due to go in. Their mandate actually expires on the 20th of July. They have no power to do anything other than observe, so it's not a peacekeeping mission, it's not a peace enforcement mission. And so it's fairly limited in what it can achieve. It can simply report back to the UN, which, as I pointed out, is not in a position to do anything anyway. So it's a situation that's really not going anywhere at the moment. I think that was my last slide. Yep. Okay, I'm happy to listen to your comments or take any questions or so. We've got, say, 10 minutes left now. Yes?
Just one comment and some questions. First of all, in terms of the Christian, as you point out, there's 10% there, and that they could suffer, of course, under major changes there. And
sure.
Interesting, too, in northern Syria, I believe there are quite a lot of Christians from Armenia who were originally in Turkey when the Turkish regime carried out various actions there. They escaped into Syria. Also, I think Syria contains a number of quite a large population of refugees from Iraq
and Palestinians.
Palestine.
Yeah, and Palestinians.
My questions are there too on, I believe Israel's been a bit sort of quiet about the situation in Syria until the last day or so after that Friday massacre when Netanyahu came out with a comment, but Israel seems to be playing a strange sort of game. I don't know whether you want to comment on that.
I understand what Israel is doing is providing arms and money at the moment to the Syrian opposition groups, because they're keen to displace the Assad regime if they possibly can, because they see that as a way of dealing with Hezbollah in Lebanon. It would weaken Hezbollah, which of course is their main concern. So that's what they're currently doing. I think the Americans are mainly working through northern Lebanon. Whether they're working with the Israelis, who are mainly working in southern Lebanon, I'm not too sure. But both of them are in the process of arming the opposition groups and providing funding. Yes.
I asked you about the Shabiha, I think that was called. Do I take it from your description that they are sort of a civilian militia out of the Alawite population? But I presume they've got some unofficial support by the regime that use them. Could you explain that relationship a bit more?
The Shabiha, there are people from the Makabarat, the intelligence and security areas, that are part of the Shabiha. There are people from the military.
Unofficial?
Yeah, unofficially, yeah. I mean, they're sort of deniable, I suppose. It's deniable what they're doing. But there's also thugs and criminals, people that have been released from jail that have joined the Shabiha as well, under the guise of being nationalists or patriots or whatever. So you've got a mix of really nasty people there, I think, and quite ruthless. And I mean, clearly, if they're prepared to cut the throats of children, that sort of thing, I mean, I don't think you get much lower than that. But they serve a purpose in the sense that they are intended to intimidate the locals from supporting the armed opposition and telling the regime if there's, a gathering of people in their area, that sort of thing. So essentially, that's what their role is. But of course, as soon as the armed opposition move into an area, as many civilians as can will flee because they know what's going to happen. If they stick around, they're most likely to become victims. But I think that should be. Sorry?
Is there evidence that the government is sort of informally sort of using as part of the
they are.
strategy? Is there evidence about that?
There's not a formal evidence of that. I haven't seen anybody that's in the Shabiha come up and sort of, say how they're linked to the regime. But I think pretty clearly they are, because I mentioned about the secret police. I mean, they're very obvious everywhere, and it would be very difficult for a group to operate independently, I think, of that. So they're clearly operating with the agreement of the regime, and it's just attacking some really ruthless and nasty people. And I think many of them are probably just in it for the loot, because they'll go into an area, kill people, take everything they've got. So it's a very nasty element, but getting the government to do anything about it is going to be problematic, because they deny that they're existing, you see, or that they are involved. They put all of these killings down to the armed opposition. And there's no point, the armed opposition would not do that, because they're Sunni Muslims. The victims are Sunni Muslims. They're hardly likely to be going around killing their own people and their potential supporters. Yeah.
You're talking entitled Hasan's dilemma. Is it his dilemma, or is it rather more the West dilemma? Because he seems to have an inexhaustible supply of security forces. Will he not just go on and on?
I think his dilemma was probably earlier on was, what is there an exit strategy here? And I think clearly for him there isn't now, so he probably doesn't have a dilemma. The dilemma has shifted now to the West and to others who would like the regime to be changed. But as I pointed out, I think there's no exit strategy for people like him. I mean, where would they go? He's going to go on trial. I mean, it's a bit like the situation was with Gaddafi or Saddam Hussein. They might as well hang in there because there are no alternatives for them. And in his case too, there are a lot of people who won't want him to go. Even if he wanted to step down, he probably couldn't, because it would affect family interests and all of the people that would lose out by the fall of the Assad dynasty. Yeah.
What is the...
Sorry, I'll come back to you in a moment.
What is the news media situation like inside Syria? Is the regime using much covert propaganda?
They have their own media outlets, of course, which continue to put a spin on things and report things in the way that they want reported. That's why it's often quite difficult to know what exactly did happen in a local area, because it may be several days before any independent people can get in there. I mean, that was one of the issues with the mobile phone footage, is that you're getting, you can see footage, but you often don't know when it was taken, who it was taken by, and all that kind of thing, because it's being taken by amateurs, and the regular media can't get into these places. So that's why one of the requirements of the Kofi Annan was that free access for the media, so that you wouldn't get these kind of excesses that are going on in areas where there are no observers and no media. Sorry.
Given the escalating violence, the increasing quantity of arms going to the opposition, the massive majority that the Sunnis have, is it not inevitable somewhere along the line that the point of balance will shift and there will be another Libya-type situation?
It's possible, but I think if you look at Saddam's Iraq as a comparable case, I think Saddam would have been able to hang on because he was in that situation with a very powerful secret police and had control of the military as well. So it was a parallel situation, and the only way really to displace someone like that in the next 10 years, I'd have thought, would be something like an invasion, or maybe assassination might be another way there was an attempt recently to poison some of the key people in the regime, but apparently it was not successful. But short of actually being able to eliminate particular individuals, it's going to be very difficult, I think, to achieve regime change. And I agree with that. At some point there'll be a tipping, because you can't keep the majority down forever, but it could take a very long time, and there'll be a lot more lives lost in the meantime. Yes, sir.
I was just going to go back to the word shepherd, which is a ghost, really. Someone who's a ghost of something that could be someone who's a real thing. And the real thing is the Syrian army, or the intelligence behind the Shia group. Going back to the Arab, in particular, the concerned states, the Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and the rest that are concerned with Syria's demise. How do we just have two fans having consuming the same fire or fanning the same fire? You've got the West supporting the uprising. And these states are so scared of the change of the regime in the state, funding also the government in itself. I come from Sudan, where we had Saudi Arabia actually have planes, we knocked them out in our country, using China company, climb on the trees and stuff, firing at the fan of these things. They fell off. And what do we have? So why the West is not asking the same question to these 3, 4 states where, stop fanning the flame war. And then I feel our job, and that is to change the regime, and maybe to support the other thing.
Yeah, it's. I think the best that could be hoped for really is to convince the regime to move slowly towards a transition process, which to become more inclusive and more democratic, and give it time to get to that point. So maybe that would lead to a downturn in the violence, and give some people the prospect, at least in the the next 10, 15 years, that things will change. But I think it's going to be very problematic to get anything achieved in the short term. It may be that because of pressure on Russia, Russia will put pressure on Assad to reel back the Shabiha, and we won't see the kind of massacres that occurred in Hula. That's not in the regime's interest, I would have thought. But particularly if it's not achieving the objective of intimidating the population. But yeah, I think we'll see things continue much as they are. I wrote a piece in early February, and I wouldn't really change much in it. Nothing much has changed between February and May in terms of what's happening in Syria and what the likelihood of outcomes are. So yeah, sorry, I know you've been.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Some analysts and journalists, very few, have questioned whether it's really in the interests of the United States and Israel to support the Free Syrian Army in the opposition. The reason being, or what would be left if the Assad regime would fall, could be a situation like Iraq after the Saddam Hussein regime is removed. When the regime is removed, so is the governance, the institutions of government. So you would see Syria with a situation possibly a little bit more friendly to Al-Qaeda, which is through the West, of course, and a situation where there's no real institution of government to take over from that greater chaos, more pressure on Israel. So, for example, would you care to comment on that? And maybe what would Syria look like if the Assad regime was removed?
Well, I think the prospect is that you'd have a high level of instability and the potential for an extremist regime to take control in Syria, a Sunni extremist regime. So that obviously would not be in the West's interests either. So to some extent, I suppose, having a contained situation like it is at the moment, at least it's putting things on the back burner. Regime change in an unsatisfactory way could mean that you end up with either Libya or you end up with an extreme regime, the kind of thing that has occurred in other places. So clearly there's a lot of uncertainties about all of that. And I think that the level of arming and so on, it may be clear in a year's time how effective that is being in terms of being able to move the situation forward. But the danger, of course, is you end up with a lot more bloodletting and a civil war type situation there. So it's very difficult to predict what will actually happen in the future. I certainly.
This is one of the motivations why the UN just and Western forces really won't go that step to
Yeah.
the Libya-style intervention. It just seemed a very bad choice.
It is, yeah. I mean, the UN sort of really is not in a position to do anything very much, and I don't think a lot's going to change there. There'll be a lot of rhetoric and more talk about, I think we're talking about more sanctions. Not that that's going to be very effective, because sanctions tend to hurt the population, and if the majority of the population are the victims, we're just hurting the victims. So the sanctions way is not really a way to go, it doesn't seem to me. But I think that somehow we're going to have to work with the regime, either mainly through the Russians probably, to try and get things moving towards a more democratic system in due course. Better stop there, because it's 5-2 now, and if you're going to move on to the other one, then you need to sort of get moving. Thank you very much for coming.